In 1858, British Crown rule was established in India, ending a century controlled by the East India Company. Due to the Industrial Revolution in Britain, they began to export more raw materials. This caused competition to increase, and the British began to see themselves as more superior to India, which then initiated the period called the Raj, in which Britain took over the country of India. Britain wanted to protect their textile from other competition such as India and the US. They banned imports of dyed and printed cotton from India, which led to India suffering through deindustrialization. Furthermore, the British also made use of the caste system and the cultural differences within. The British consulted the Punjab regarding matters of irrigation and the Sikhs regarding matters of warfare. It was important to the British to utilize each group to their fullest potential. After the Crown Raj takeover, reforms were instituted which emphasized tolerance of the various religions of the area, as well as the recruitment of members of the indigenous population into the civil service. While the Crown Raj sought to avoid further rebellions regarding the reforms, they increased the British military presence in India. Due to the cultural contact with the British and Eurocentric perspective, India was taken over and they lost their cotton industry. Since their lives revolved around this industry and were deindustrialized, the greatest impact of British policies was the drain of wealth from India. The Indian economy was primarily a rural economy, but Indian artisans produced goods in bulk to meet the demands of Indian and European buyers. This allowed several towns to flourish as centers of trade. Although the British merchants bought these Indian products in large quantities at the beginning of the 18th century, Britain and other European countries passed laws prohibiting the entry of cotton and silk textiles from India, although there is a demand for it. After the Industrial Revolution, India was forced to produce cotton and other products which British industries required. Indian markets were flooded with cheap machine-made textiles manufactured in England, and since Indian handmade textiles could not compete with the cheap machine-made textiles, India was forced to transform into a supplier of raw materials and a market for British manufactured goods. While British goods were exempted from duties while entering Indian markets, Indian goods entering England were burdened with heavy custom duties. India's economy collapsed under the impact of British colonial policies. With the decline of the cotton industry, the towns that had flourished as centers of trade or industry also declined.
The main objective of the East India Company was to buy as much Indian goods as possible at the lowest price possible, and sell their goods in Britain and other foreign countries so that substantial profits would be made. This affected India's traditional export industry, and in particular their cotton industry. The government forced people to sell their products below market prices, which reduced their status to indentured laborers and gave them a life of poverty. As new discoveries and technologies were made, trade increased. As trade increased, so did the competition, in which the prize was power. Nation after nation colonized as much land as they could to expand their empires. This led to many historical events such as the scramble for Africa, and in particular the Raj. Britain wanted to eliminate any nation that stood in its way to power. India posed a threat to Britain because of their cotton industry, so as a result, Britain banned all imports of cotton from India to boycott their nation. Rather than industrialization, India went through a period of deindustrialization due to the banned importing of Indian goods into Britain. Britain already had the upper hand with India because of the amount of colonies Britain possessed. Britain took advantage of their control over India and exploited them by corrupting company officials and imposing high taxes, even though the majority of people had no jobs. The East India Company sometimes even used brutal measures to protect their trade interests. For example, officials would sometimes cut off the thumbs of Indian weavers who were caught selling their cloth to traders from other companies. When imperialist powers colonized lands, the outcome for indigenous peoples were always catastrophic. India, in particular, suffered through famine, deindustrialization, displacement, and slavery. For example, the existence of chattel slavery was prominent in this time and was primarily for Arabian and European colonial markets under the East India Company. Some Britons were involved in buying, selling, and exporting Indian slaves, transferring them around the subcontinent or to the European slave colonies across the globe. The French Revolution and the defeat of Napoleon distracted the French from expanding their control in India. The British used this opportunity to kick all other colonial powers out of India. By the 18th century, India was under a crisis. The East India Company used this period to increase their divisions with their divide and rule policy. India had a very weak navy, but Britain's naval superiority helped the British to gain and build critical ports of India and build the empire from there. Britain's Eurocentric attitude and the treatment of India as an inferior nation led India into a valley of famine, deindustrialization, and the loss of a culture. However, Gandhi showed India a peaceful way to gain their independence from Britain. Today, Gandhi is seen as one of the most influential leaders in history because of how he led India out of British control and into independence. In August 1942 marked the start of the Quit India movement, in which the goal was to see massive peaceful demonstrations and denial of authority undermining the British war effort. Finally, in 1947, India gained independence.
In August of 1947, the British finally left India after 300 years. The subcontinent was parted into two independent nation-states. The majority Hindu were India and Muslim majority was Pakistan. This resulted in the greatest migration in human history. Millions of Muslims then had to migrate to the west and east Pakistan, later known as Bangladesh. Meanwhile, the Hindus headed in the opposite direction. What caused India to split into two countries was the fact that Muhammad Ali Jinnah wanted Muslims to have their own independent country. If India was not split into countries, he would declare war of the Muslims against the Hindus. Before the Britons came to rule India, they were self-sufficient in textile and cotton products, but during the British rule, India fell down to the position of importing cloth from England. In the 19th century AD, British government abolished the tariff protection of Indian goods. The country was reduced to the position of supplier of raw materials to British industries. In 1850, jute mills were established in India, but there was no economic development in the country. The event in history occurred due to the fact that Mahatma Gandhi wanted India to be an independent country. Gandhi wanted independence for his country because for centuries England had been ripping off the Indians of resources like salt, cloth, and factory production, exploiting an entire race of people to make a small handful of people rich. People had no rights and were treated like servants and peasants. They were being exploited, robbed blind as England took their spices and minerals and precious stones without giving anything back. Historical events that led to the British Raj started when the British started to show interest in India's trading company and later arrived in the 17th century. Their primary goal was to secure trade monopolies with Indians, and gradually they gained territory through battles and diplomacy. As they began taking over India, they started to spread the word of God and Christianity among the people of India. This led to India being taken over by the British. What happened in India caused India to go through a difficult period. During this process, Gandhi fasted and was beginning to become weak to prevent the people of India from creating riots. Once they gained the rights to have freedom, there was another conflict of having to deal with Jinnah wanting India to split into two separate countries. His wish was granted, which resulted in the Great Migration. To this day, India and Pakistan is still a separate country and are no longer under Britain's rule. Evidence that the legacies and patterns that occurred in India are still evident today is the fact that India is still split in two separate countries because Jinnah wanted the Pakistanis to have their own independent country and not be under the rule of Hindus, so he demanded that they be split in two countries or war shall war. So to prevent war from happening, Gandhi accepted, which resulted in the Great Migration. With the independence of India and Pakistan, the Britons were no longer the ruler of both countries.